Hello! You're watching The Great Canadian Bagel, and today we are going to discuss pollsters, specifically. I'll get into that momentarily, but before I begin, I'd like to once again shout out my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel. If you want to support the work I do here and fund the polling that I do myself, by all means go into the link in the description below and press that join button. 100% of the proceeds goes into funding polls that I will publish publicly. No paywalls. Otherwise, if you can't afford to do that, do your regular YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. And with that, let us begin. So, there's always been a question with pollsters about how do you interpret pollsters? What is the idea behind pollsters? We have, say, this Ecos poll here that has 44-33. We have this Angus Reid is 40-38. We have a Main Street is 44-40. Abacus is 40-41. Now, the general thing people have done for the longest time is you do what you call an average. You would weight the average based off of sample size, based off of recency of the poll. So a more recent poll is weighted more than an old poll. But that still does not necessarily do the correct thing. Because if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. If the polls you are weighting are bad, you don't get a good number. It doesn't matter the outcome or the weighting you do, or the averaging you do, if the polls you have are bad. Now, why might this be the case? Why are some polls bad? Well, there's two really big reasons why pollsters do badly or miss. It could be a firm that is just bad at their job, or it could be a systemic issue that the electorate is not representative by the people they are sampling. An example of the latter would be the last U.S. presidential election in 2024. We look at these polls. Atlas Intel basically gets it exactly on point, plus or minus decimal percentages. And that's really because they were correctly modeling what the electorate is, and by doing that, they were sampling the right people. But a lot of these pollsters were not doing that. Some of them were quite off. For example, this RABA research poll had the Trump at 44% and Kamala Harris at 48%. 48 is relatively good for Harris, but 44 is a significant miss for Trump. And you see all sorts of stuff like that. And in Canada, we can look at, say, Ecos here. This is an 11-point lead. This 3 days later, Nanos has a 2-point lead. One of those necessarily has to be wrong because they're well outside of margin of error of each other. Even if you assume that Nanos is high and Ecos is low, there's almost zero overlap in the margin of error. And that is kind of a preposterous way to even look at things, but I digress. So how do you deal with this? Now, in my modeling and what my projections do, I actually have a proprietary, which I'm not going to expose today, how I calculate this or what it is, but I do have a proprietary formula that estimates to correct for predictable polling error. Now, you might think to yourself, well, surely polling misses are random, right? If it's just a matter of missing sampling or firm quality, that shouldn't be a consistent error. There shouldn't be a predictable error, but there actually is. And there's a lot of complex reasons for why there is, but I can show you very robustly that there is actually concrete bias in polling that you can correct for. It is predictable. It doesn't mean 100% of the time it will be predictable, but more often than not, it will be. So to start, let us look at just my metric that I've created. This is one I'm going to expose publicly because it's slightly different than what I use internally in my model to generate very accurate and high quality projections, and I don't want to expose that. I do not want other people to use my proprietary work. But this rating system that I've exposed, I've published on Twitter before this week. But what I'm about to discuss here, these ratings are not actually very useful if you want to try to correct modeling. At least I don't really know how I would use these to correct modeling. But they are, I think, more intuitive for the viewer to understand the quality of a firm. So first, let's start off with federal numbers. So, to qualify on this spreadsheet to be one of these pollsters, I only considered firms that have polled 3 times in the last 20 years, and they've had to poll at least once in the last 3 elections, publicly released. And these numbers are weighted. These are the weighted mean squared errors. So a mean squared error being you take the difference in polling numbers from the real result, you square it, and then you divide it by the number of parties that they're trying to estimate for. So for example, this Nanos poll has 7 categories, so you would divide it by 7. So you have the difference between the liberals and the real liberals, conservatives and the real conservatives, bloc and the real bloc, etc., etc. You square all those differences, then you divide it by 7. And that gets you the first for one particular election. Then you average it, you take a weighted average across all of the elections that they have done polls, weighting more recent elections as more important. That is why, for example, Abacus has a relatively bad score, because their last poll in 2025 was not particularly good. They did much better in 21, and 19, and I believe 2011, off the top of my head. 2015 was mediocre, or wasn't very good, sorry. Other firms here, like Leger, Main Street Research Co., all do perfectly fine. Main Street in particular, as you will know, we'll see in other parts of the rest of this video, is quite interesting. They are very strong on the federal numbers. Not necessarily the same case could be said for a lot of provincial numbers. Now, I will also note, a firm could be really good, but because of statistics, there is a 1 in 20 chance that they will always be wrong with a poll. There's always a 1 in 20 chance a poll will be wrong, and that is not the fault of the pollster. So sometimes a good firm, like Main Street's the biggest victim of this, will get a poll miss because they just poll so many times in so many elections that they're bound to get a bad poll miss. It's statistically just probable, and that can really mess up their numbers, but we'll discuss on that in some other ones. But we have some firms like Ecos and Innovative who actually do quite badly, and this is not one-off, this is pretty consistent, that they do pretty poorly. And this means, generally speaking, the smaller the number, obviously, the better. A score of 0 would mean that they always correctly predict the election results to 1 decimal point. They have no error. They've never been wrong. And if they were to get, I think the perfect possible score would be 10,000. If they got 10,000, that would mean they were completely wrong. Which I don't think is possible, but you could theoretically get 10,000, I think, maybe. And that would mean you got nothing correct. Everything is completely wrong. Which would be like, I guess, hypothetically, let's say you had a pollster that was polling right now, and instead of having like 40 liberal, 38 conservative, they were like, aha, we have 100% is going to vote Christian Heritage. That would get pretty close to 10,000 points on the metric, because that is just completely wrong. It's complete. There's not even a basis of reality in that poll. Most Twitter polls get really close to 10,000 unless they're doing actual statistics and polling math, like I've run a poll on my Twitter post kind of crowd. But we can also look at, oh, that's the wrong one. We're not going to do that one yet. you're going to do this one. This is just provincial numbers. This does not include federal numbers, and we have the same criteria. You have to have polled at least once in the last 3 elections in any province in the country, and you have to have polled at least 3 times. We get very similar scores. Ecos, you'll notice, actually goes up a little bit, but that's not because they are better at polling provincially. It just means that there's more people who are worse than them, which is a very dubious distinction. Insightrix, which mostly just polls Saskatchewan, is the worst firm. They're just awful. Council's also pretty bad. Main Street, because they've polled 28 times, is actually victim to a couple of stink eggs, and they're particularly bad for them as their 2 stink eggs are relatively recently, which was Saskatchewan 24 and Newfoundland 25, where they do really bad in those 2 elections, and that really screws up their numbers. If you account for those and you ignore that, Main Street's actually above Leger. If you ignore Saskatchewan 24 and Newfoundland 25. So those 2 elections are causing Main Street to go really low, but otherwise Main Street is actually really good. But unfortunately for them, that's just how the math be. Narrative and MQO really don't have anything to save them here. Liaison, I don't recall why they're so bad. And Forum and Research Co have had the same deal as Main Street, but their bad polls are a little older. Though I think Forum is also being hit by the Saskatchewan 24 data. And then we have the overall. This includes all provincial and all federal polls. So, in my case, my 1 federal poll, which does not count to federal because it's only 1 poll by my criteria, does now count towards my overall score, which drags down my overall score because my federal poll wasn't very good. And then we also see pollsters like Palace pop up, and they're actually really good. Palace, not having conducted 3 polls, either provincially or federally, but they have conducted 1 federal and 2 provincial that has had an election, so they are now on the scoreboard. So that's kind of how you can see. So we can quantify, in an objective sense, the quality of a firm, how good they are at polling. We can create an error score on how much, on average, they are wrong. And you can see that some firms like Ecos are not very good. Some firms like Liaison or Main Street are deceptive. We do need to look a little more detailed than this 1 number, because Liaison and Main Street actually did a lot better federally, but they got hit, and Forum to a certain extent, but they got hit by a couple of really bad recent polls, even though their average poll is better. Now, could that be a flaw in my scoring system? Perhaps, but I can't really think of a better way to set up the scoring system. It just so happens that if your last election, like if you're Main Street and you've polled 2 snake eyes in the last, 6 elections you've polled, that's pretty bad. Even if otherwise you're pretty good. But it is what it is. And the Saskatchewan 24 and Newfoundland 25 were 2 of the biggest poll misses in general. So perhaps I could try to factor in the average poll level of poll miss into this, but for now I have not done that. But there's something else we can do on top of this. We can expand this further, because this is just a singular number. This is just assessing how good is a firm. But we can also assess, what does a firm's bias look like? And that's a slightly different number. Fortunately, I cannot color code it because it doesn't really make sense to color code the bias numbers. So we're going to go pull this out. Oh, I need to close these. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Sure, save. Okay, move these out. There we go. We can bring these up. Unfortunately, again, I can't make these color-coded because it looks too chaotic. Excel's not competent at this. I will reformat this cell, though. Actually, give me a second. Okay, we are back with these cleaned up because I took a little bit of cleaning up. Don't want to do that live. So, We're now back. These are just the federal numbers, but we have broken these into what I call the left score and the right score. Now, the right score is the mean squared error of the right wing, and the left score is the mean squared error of the left wing. So how these are calculated is I add up, for example, federally, the Conservatives plus the People's Party polling numbers and compare them to the results and square the difference. And I add the Liberals, NDP, Greens together federally, compare them to the real result, square the difference, etc. I have ignored the Bloc, and I have ignored Quebec provincially, because I don't think the motivation for the Bloc Québécois is necessarily a left versus right one, and provincially, I don't really think you can map the Liberal Party Quebec, the Parti Québécois, or the CAQ very neatly onto the otherwise left-right spectrum of Canada. I don't think they neatly map at all, so I don't think it's very meaningful to include them. So I've excluded Quebec provincial polls, and I've excluded the Bloc Québécois federally. And we kind of get, what we get here is this data. You'll notice, federally, every single firm except Main Street has a slight left-wing bias. I will just clarify here. Positive numbers mean that they overestimate left-wing support. Negative, or overestimate a side's support. Negative means they underestimate it. So Main Street is the only federal pollster with 3 or more qualifying polls that has a bias against the left and to the right, though their overall bias is quite low, being negative 0.64 and 2.76. Those are quite small. Most firms are slightly biased to the left, as you can see here. Some like Ecos or Innovative have quite large average biases to the left. Some other firms like Forum have pretty low biases overall. Same thing with Abacus, relatively low bias overall. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, but if Forum has a very low bias here, but on the other metric, they were only relatively average, how does that make sense? Well, this is telling us, is there a bias left versus right in Forum's polling, whereas the other one was telling us how good Forum is as a pollster. So this score tells us Forum is not very biased. The other score tells us, is Forum very good? We can see here, Ecos is the most biased pollster federally, by a lot. This is a very, very large error, which is why you get results like this, where the Conservatives are at 33. If you add the PPC, they're at 36. Then you look at any other firm, even Liaison right now, who has a very bearish number for the right, is at 37. So Ecos has a worse score than the next worst score that the right pollster has for the right in Canada. And they have a higher score for the left than everyone else does. Because again, not only does Liaison have 1 point more for the right, they also have 0.6 more for the Bloc. Now if we go provincially, this is provincially, we get similar numbers. Though this time, due to possibly weird math quirks, because of the averaging, Nanos has a bias against everybody, which is quite interesting. And I am now the only pollster who has a slight right-wing bias. Though my overall bias numbers, you can see here, are quite low. I'm, relatively speaking, comparable to, say, Leger's bias, but the inverse. So whereas Leger has a slight left-wing bias, I have a slight right-wing bias. But we're about the same level of biasness. Other ones, like, again, Incitrix, which is truly an awful firm, has hilariously large bias score of 117 underestimation for the right. Ecos still doesn't perform very well. So this is one of the reasons why I exclude Ecos from my polling models, because Ecos is not very good. And you could say down here, oh, but Research Co has a very big bias here. Yes, but as I've touched on before, this Research Co. and this Main Street poll and the liaison numbers, a lot of these are being carried by one bad recent election. These Ecos ones are just bad. They've never been good. Though I will caveat, Ecos is surprisingly good in Ontario. So an Ecos poll provincially in Ontario is actually reasonably good. That's the only province I've noticed that they're reasonably good with. I don't know why that's the case, but that is just what it is. And if we can look at all. Again, we get similar numbers. My bias clamped down a little bit, but it's still slightly right-wing. I don't think anyone's that surprised by it, given how I'm sampling. Insight West has a slight right-wing bias too, though unfortunately they don't poll anymore. They got bought out by Leger, and they no longer operate as a separate company, which is unfortunate, because actually Insight West was a better firm than Leger was. But it be like that sometimes. It just be like that. So yeah, those are the overall numbers. So, as I've touched on, we can quantify how good or how bad a pollster is. And because it is predictable and it is quantifiable, you can actually adjust for this. Now, some people, such as Philip Fournier at 338 Canada, use what their pollster scores, which are letter grades, and they weight averages accordingly. But I disagree with that system, and I don't use anything remotely similar to that system, because first off, we have this bias issue. But then, more importantly to the bias issue, I don't know why that's wanting me to save this. More importantly to the bias issue, we have... Did I not save? Whatever. We'll zoom in. We have the quality issue. Not all firms are equally good. And they're not equally biased. And they're not predictably good. So, for example, if we were to give a letter grade to Main Street right now, they're not doing very good. But that's actually not the correct way to understand Main Street, because it's being carried by 2 of their 32 polls. Just 2 of them, 2 polls, are causing them to be down here instead of right here. And they've done this 32 times. Forum also equally, I think it's like 3 polls pulling them down here from being like around here. So there is kind of a bias towards being recently bad polls if you do a lot of polls, but it is what it is. But the letter grades don't really work because there is bias inside the pollsters and how they do left or right. And there is still quality issues. Like, yes, maybe we could weight based on just this quality, but you're going to miss the partisanship bias. So you have to factor in both, and it doesn't really look like to me that people like Fournier have done that, which I think is why I outperform Fournier on modeling. So yes, we can identify a pollster bias. Yes, it usually is consistent. Yes, it usually is predictable. So then you might ask yourself, why don't pollsters fix this? Well, first, they usually try to, but more importantly it's more complex than you think it is. How you sample controls who you are going to get. For example, if I do live telephone callers Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. or like 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., I am going to wildly oversample seniors and people who don't have a job, be it a job outside the house. So be it like stay-at-home mothers, be it disabled, be it unemployed, whatever. People who do not work at home are going to be more likely to answer a live caller phone between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. I hope that is self-explanatory. Conversely, with an online panel, you are more likely to get very niche voters responding. because you're going to be likely you're going to be engaging the people who are joined your panel. So you're going to engage people who are more politically active. You're going to be engaging people who have more of a reason to want to do a poll, as opposed to being a truly random sample. Now, that doesn't mean an online poll or a live telephone poll can be bad necessarily. It just means that they have the mode you've polled has a bias. How you recruit for your surveys has a bias. IVR versus live caller versus online has a bias. IVR's bias, it seems, is probably lower on average, unless you're a garbage firm like Ecos, no offense. Actually, offense intended. IVR seems to have less of a bias because you can IVR call 24 hours a day. Well, you probably shouldn't call in the middle of the night, but you can call IVR call like 8 a.m. to like 10 p.m. or something like that. So you're not constrained by a human worker having to call people. So, in a sense, IVR is better in that regard, but it still runs into issues of IVR picks up people who are more likely to answer the phone, which is not necessarily the same thing as people who are more likely to vote. So you still have fundamental biases like that, but then you also have another consideration as well, and this is really what makes a good pollster from a bad pollster. Yes, you could sample online. You could sample by IVR. You could sample by a live caller. Okay. You've sampled people. How do you turn a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet into a prediction to a federal or provincial poll? That is a non-obvious thing. There are methods to do this. There are well-known and well-discussed things. If you take data modeling or statistics or data mining classes in like a university, you can learn stuff about some of this stuff. They will not teach it in reference to political polling, but it's the same ideas. Big data, basically, is interchangeable. But that's a non-obvious. And how you do that, and what assumptions you make while doing that, are going to change your numbers. The biggest two you can make are, do you ask for voter recall? In other words, do you ask people voted in the last election? And how many filters do you put on the data? There's pros and cons to this. There is issues with voter recall. People can forget who they voted for. If you have a lot of people who did not vote in the last election but are voting now, you now have a very hard thing to address. You have to try to weight this influx of new voters that you do not have a comparison point against, which is non-obvious and complicated. And then with how many filters do you use? Are you as simple as sex, age? Do you add urbanicity? Do you add education? Do you add income? Do you add race? Do you add language spoken at home? There's all sorts of other criteria you might think as well. Do you add religion? None of these are particularly obvious, but the more filters you use, the larger of a sample size you need for the poll to really work properly. There is kind of a minimum sample size you need for a certain amount of data. Otherwise, you start introducing skews. Now, I'm not going to say Main Street is wrong for doing this. Their polls are perfectly fine. But Main Street includes race data, but they usually only have about 1,000 people. Maybe if they're lucky, and maybe it's during a campaign, they might get 1,500, maybe 2,000 respondents. But when you're trying to break out East Asians versus South Asians versus Indians versus Middle Eastern, European, Hispanic, Black, etc., Native American, and you only have 1,000 people, some of these buckets are going to be very small. I think the average sample for the Native American bucket's like 20 or 30 people. 20 or 30 people is quite a small sample. There's a lot of potential noise that can happen there. And you don't necessarily have very good data what their past behavior looks like. And then that's the other factor as well that complicates both of these two things, is how do you model what it is now from what it is in the past? Because if you don't weight properly, you don't model properly, you're going to get really weird results that are going to be very different. So this is all to say, yes, pollsters do have biases. The biases are usually baked in methodologically. They can change their methodologies or address them. I have personally changed my methodology since 2025, the election. And there are better and worse firms. And these are quantifiable. These are predictable. These are consistent over time. Unless a firm proactively makes a change in how they do things. But I hope this kind of in-depth discussion about how you assess pollsters and what you should consider. I hope this was interesting. If you kind of like this video, by all means, let me know in the comments below. Well, that, I bid you guys... eventually, just on one side note, this is not going to happen anytime soon. But eventually I'm going to have a website. And when I have a website, these scores will be posted on the website. If you want a website to happen faster, by all means, you should donate below so I can afford to get a website set up. You might think to yourself, well, can't you just make your own website? I don't have time to make myself a website. If I had more money, I could spend my own time to do it, but I don't have the time, so it is what it is. If you don't care about that, don't do anything then. Just keep doing your regular YouTube things. With that, I bid you guys adieu, and I'll see you next time with something else.